Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. I am Dr. Karen Wilson. I'm your host, and I am thrilled to have you back here for another discussion about something that's really important to kids who learn and think differently. And today we're talking about self-regulation and co-regulation. My guest today is Danielle Kent. She graduated with her master's in speech language pathology and has worked in a variety of settings. She is dedicated towards equipping and empowering parents and professionals to support the development of self-regulation and joyful, autonomous communication by prioritizing co-regulation. Danielle also runs the Brainy SLP podcast and the Brainy SLP YouTube station. So be sure to check out the show notes so that you will have links to the podcast and the YouTube station. Now, let's dive into my conversation with Danielle.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hi, Danielle. Welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Well, I'm so glad to be here.
I am thrilled that you are here, and it looks like we both have coffee.
We both have coffee. Perfect thing to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said before we hit record, it's been so long. We've been talking about having you on the podcast, and it just, life got in the way, and we were both busy, and I'm so glad that we're able to make it happen. So
glad to be here.
Yeah. And I've heard so many wonderful things about the work that you do. So again, I'm excited that you're here. And you know, one of the things that I see a lot in my practice and from talking to other parents, teachers, and other professionals who work with kids and adolescents is that we see a lot of kids struggling to manage big emotions, right? They often have really big feelings and sometimes have trouble expressing those feelings, which are absolutely important to have, but expressing it appropriately in some settings can be problematic at times.
Yes. And I think normalizing, I love to hear the normalizing of big feelings. And I think this all started, my son, Troy, who's now 4.5, like my work in co-regulation really started with him around, he's just a different regulator than my daughter was. My daughter, disappointments, changes, her brain just rerouted a little easier. And that's what I call, or just in a different way. My son's just routed differently. And so has always been my one with bigger feelings. And the way it shows up though, like he is the biggest lover and he gives the best hugs and he's so empathetic. And I think about the spectrum of big feelings that our kids who often have big, intense feelings around frustration and anger, they often have those same feelings around, empathy and love. And so that's why I've been really passionate about, normalizing big feelings, helping kids learn to work with their big feelings, because I want them to become tuned into what's happening for them. It's really important to me.
Absolutely. And I love that you said that, because it's really important to not shut down the feelings kids are having and say, don't do that, don't say that, don't feel that. It's okay to feel it, but we have to kind of be mindful about how those big feelings can sometimes get you in trouble if it's expressed inappropriately. If you're in the middle of the test and you're banging the desk because your pencil broke and you're throwing things across the room, well, that's not appropriate. What is a better way to channel those big emotions? But having the frustration itself, there's nothing wrong with that.
Nothing inherently wrong with that. And I think one of my biggest, as a speech language pathologist, I always talk about prioritizing co-regulation for joyful and autonomous communication. Meaning I'm here and I'm listening to what you're communicating to me, and I want to validate you. I want your communication to be autonomous. I want you to tell me when you're feeling overwhelmed and frustrated. And I want to, equip you with tools so that you can communicate that to whoever you're with, wherever you are, in a way that's going to support you to be heard and move forward with the conversation. And that's for me the autonomous part too, and joyous communication. It comes from feeling seen, heard, understood, validated. And so that's, going back to co-regulation, why for me I'm just such a big advocate for it. joy and autonomy. That's two key factors for me in communication interactions.
Absolutely. And we've already jumped into that self-regulation and co-regulation. So for people listening who may not understand what those two things are, what we mean, they may have seen the behaviors, right? Heard the emotional expression, but what do you mean? Let's start there. Let's back up and talk about what do you mean by self-regulation and then co-regulation?
Got it. Self-regulation is that ability to connect the dots between our thoughts, feelings, and our behaviors. It's our ability to connect where am I in the moment, what experience am I having, and what do I need to do to stay present in this moment, or to safely leave this moment to come back to. It's kind of managing all of those pieces of yourself. And I always say, I use sometimes self-regulation and executive function interchangeably because that ability to direct ourselves forward, that's executive. That's the heart of executive functioning, being able to direct ourselves forward and figure out what we need to do next. And so self-regulation is that same thing, that ability to kind of guide ourselves, connect those dots between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And that, as adults are often told in loose ways, like it doesn't develop until later. It's because, our brain is so rapidly developing throughout, the lifespan, but especially, birth to the mid-20s when so much architecture is being wired in the brain. And so that ability to direct ourselves, really is rapidly developing from birth to 5, continues to develop up through the mid-20s. And then for the rest of our lives, we're continuing to develop those self-regulation skills of how do we manage ourselves and how do we as adults handle big feelings and tough interactions. And so we never really stop growing. But I always say, for me, I'm going to switch over to what is co-regulation. I always say co-regulation is the new self-regulation because co-regulating is regulating with. And so at the most early age, co-regulation is that caregiver. When the infant is completely unable to regulate their system, they can't feed themselves, they're just basically wiring on survival reflexes. The caregiver is wholly responsible for regulating the infant, changing them when they're wet, feeding them when they're hungry, soothing them when their nervous system is distressed. That's co-regulation, regulating with. And then as that infant gets older and older, they slowly take over some responsibility as they grow older and learning how to manage their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But they continue to need that adult support and guidance. And that's the co-regulation, regulating with that caregiver saying, or that adult saying, I'm here with you to help you learn how to regulate, to help you learn these skills. And parents don't get enough support and understanding that that's normal and a healthy part of development. I think parents sometimes get the message that by the time you're 4, by the time you're 5, you must be able to regulate yourself, and there's no one size fits all. Some kids need longer periods of, co-regulation with adults to develop those skills. So co-regulation, regulating with.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important that you talked about how it coincides with brain development. And we see this when you see, a 2-year-old who has a tantrum in the grocery store because they can't have a piece of candy. Well, you wouldn't expect the same regulation or lack of regulation skills in a 12-year-old, right? But it's completely appropriate for a 2-year-old who hasn't learned to kind of regulate those big feelings and those big emotions. And at that age, it's so important for parents to co-regulate with their child. But we also know, because we talk about a lot of kids who are wired differently, who struggle with aspects of executive functioning, some of them need support with those self-regulation skills at a time when maybe other kids their age don't need that level of support.
Yes, exactly. And that's where I think it's hard sometimes for caregivers and families if they've gotten the message that they should have this skill by now, when really that prolonged period of when I talk about co-regulation, I talk about it responsively and proactively. Responsively is when your child is dysregulated, responding to them with warm affect, helping them return to regulation, non-judgmentally, providing a safe environment. That to me is responsive co-regulation. That's how I define it. And then proactive is teaching, structuring the environment. And this is from the Miller and colleagues article, and I can send it to you, Karen, so you have a copy of it. It's a great article about toxic stress and self-regulation. But proactive co-regulation is kind of structuring the environment for safety and success, and also teaching and coaching self-regulation skills. And so sometimes learners who are regulating differently, and I always struggle, I don't know if you have this experience. When I say different now, I wonder different than what? And when I say different from neurotypical, right? But we're really thinking about embracing neurodiversity. It's maybe different than neurotypical, but all of it's on a trajectory of normal somewhere. We're just all developing on our own curve. But kids who might take and benefit from longer co-regulation, I want to just like try and change the narrative that that's bad or wrong. It just is. It is. And so those kids might benefit from prolonged responding to co-regulation in non-judgmental ways. What we really don't want to do is create the potential for further trauma by punishing kids when they're really in stress behavior mode, and then not giving them the tools they need for success. Teaching and coaching and modeling those self-regulation skills. Kids having a chance to practice tools that work for them when they're regulated. Those are things that might need to be done over a longer period of time than what their neurotypical peers might need. And that's okay. We want autonomy and joy in our life.
Absolutely. And when you get that article, I'll make sure that we put a link to it in the show notes as well. So if people are listening and they want to get that information, they'll have it. And, a lot of the self-regulation issues that we see look differently in different kids. So maybe we can talk about kind of what does that look like? Because sometimes parents are looking at these behaviors and they may think it's a mood issue. Is it just a tantrum? Is it depression? Is it anxiety? And it could be those things. But like you said, it could also be executive functioning. So what do some of those behaviors look like at home and even maybe in the classroom? And then we can talk about some strategies.
Yeah. And when I do workshops on executive function, I often have this behavior flow chart that we talk about. Like, here are some behaviors that you might see, and here's what might be happening for a learner or for a child at home. I guess it's a good chance for me to interject here. Executive function skills. George McCloskey, who's a big researcher in the field of executive functioning, breaks down executive functioning into 33 skills, 33 separate skills.
Yes.
That direct us on a day-to-day basis. And he also talks about how, executive function skills go from all the way from the skills that wake us up in the morning, all the way to the skills that help us find our higher purpose in life. Large range of skills.
Huge range. And continuing to develop all the way into the mid-20s. And so the expectations continue to change.
Yes. I would say most of the time, the things that people associate with behaviors, this is why I love Stuart Shanker's reframing of misbehavior to stress behavior. Most of the things we see as behaviors are really stress behaviors as a result of sometimes differently developing executive function skills. So the ones that really pop up are like difficulties, what I call rerouting. So you can't have you can't watch your show right now. Maybe you can't have that food that you really want. Maybe you can't finish playing that game. It's that rerouting, that ability to say, okay, I wanted to do this. I got to go to a plan B for one reason or another. And that's like the heart of executive function.
Right. That's shifting.
I call EF's your GPS, like mapping out your route. Oh, that route's not going to work. Okay. I got to reroute to a different route. How fast my brain can do that is just an executive function skill. And I give adults the analogy, like we have so many, like our phones are our GPS now, but imagine you're in the middle of nowhere and your GPS and your phone dies out and you have no idea where to go and what to do. That's what I feel like sometimes happens for our kids when we're like, this can't happen. The thing that you had mapped out in your brain can't happen. Now we got to do it to this plan. And it's like, I don't have that mapped out yet. How do I map that out? It's so stressful for our kids sometimes.
It absolutely can be stressful. And then when we don't understand that the reason behind the behavior is that struggle with self-regulation or executive functioning, then we may not respond in an appropriate way. And so what are some good strategies when parents and educators are seeing these struggles with self-regulation that they can utilize with kids?
One of the hearts of co-regulation is that it's really about the adult. It's really about us, what's happening for us, and how can we focus on regulating ourselves. And so, when I work with parents, when I work with teams, sometimes some, internal triggers will come up, and I'll kindly suggest sometimes going to therapy. And so in working on that, if a child's dysregulation is really triggering for you, there's no bad or good here. It's just recognizing what's happening, because your ability to be regulated and support your child when they're having a hard time is so important. You you matter in that interaction so tremendously. And so whatever you need to do, and this has been harder in the pandemic, right? The last 2 years, the ability to take care of ourselves has looked a lot different than what it did pre-pandemic. But I use the COAST acronym. So when a child is becoming dysregulated or is dysregulated, I use the COAST acronym. So C, check on yourself. What's happening for you when the child becomes dysregulated? And sometimes for a minute, what it does for the adult is just can slow you down from labeling the behavior that you might like defiant, whatever that is. If you're checking on yourself first and tuning in, saying, okay, what's happening for me as I'm watching this behavior? Check on yourself, see. And the O is observe and acknowledge what's happening for them. Just observe the actual behaviors you could catch in a black and white photo. Are they stomping their feet? Are they clenching their fists? Are they throwing things? What's happening? And then really seek to acknowledge what the experience is for them. This isn't like a fact versus fiction. So if they're really mad that you're taking away Paw Patrol, whatever it is they're saying, this isn't a time to think like, well, I'm not trying to do that. It's okay. So that's their experience. They're seeking to acknowledge their experience. And if you aren't quite sure, the A is also ask. Ask questions. What could be happening for them? And I don't actually mean ask like language-wise ask, because when we're dysregulated, the least language, the better.
You can't take in the information.
And take in any information. But although like it's a human tendency, when somebody's becoming upset, if we don't know that strategy, the human tendency is to want to like talk people down. It's just a normal reflex. So knowing when somebody's dysregulated, the least language possible. And then I'll never forget in Dr. Dan Siegel's, one of his books, he talks about how when you're dysregulated, you tune into people's face the most instead of biological response, because we're like, are you safe or not? And so I say, like, think about what you're doing with your face, because most people, when somebody else is becoming dysregulated, we ourselves become, our face gets really tense and our body gets tense. So it kind of comes back to like, okay, what's happening for you? Presenting a calm, supportive stance. And then the S of the COAST is support. So you think about your job. Your role is to support them to return back to that regulation zone. And then the T is make a note of what skills could be taught when they're regulated. So if you're taking note of like, it seems to be really hard when the show ends. When their show ends, it seems like that's a repeated trigger. Make a note of that. Okay, what strategies can we teach? Maybe we can have a visual timer. Maybe I'm going to step in and say, hey, you've got 5 minutes left of your show, just giving you a heads up. It's just thinking about, okay, what around this could they benefit for some teaching around, which is that proactive part of co-regulation, is the teaching those skills.
And that's such a great strategy for parents. And I think it's something practical that they can keep in their minds and that will really help them in the moment. And then, like you said, after the child is no longer dysregulated, to have that teaching moment, because it helps them to develop strategies, proactive strategies for when these behaviors might emerge in the future.
Yes, exactly. And there's so many great tools, but I think if we can take the pressure off when in the moment of dysregulation, we're not teaching, we're just supporting. Our role is really supporting, and also honoring what's happening for you and being tuned into what's happening for me in this, dysregulated exchange, because my experience also matters here.
Right. Absolutely. And I love that you talked about that, the emphasis on the parent, because that is such an important piece. And you talked about Dan Siegel's work and how that connection between the parent and child is so important. And then when you can meet them with that from that place of calm, it actually helps the child to calm down as well. But as a parent, and I'm a parent, you're a parent, when you are getting ready to go to school in the morning and you have a certain amount of time and the dysregulation issue pops up just before you leave the house, it's really tough. I think we have to acknowledge that it's really tough for parents too.
It's so tough. And I always say, I try and really talk about this imperfectly. So I don't get this right every time. I'm not a robot. No, I'm a human.
Neither.
with my own set of triggers, my own dysregulation. And so I also am continually modeling and leading. And if I am like, we gotta go, and my voice gets loud and I lose my cool for a minute, I'm like, oh, that happened. But then I'll take it as, if I can, I'll take it as an opportunity to be like, wow, I got really frustrated there, didn't I? I'm going to just step away and do some breathing for a couple seconds. And so I can return myself back to calm. And so remembering, like, as parents, we are coaching imperfectly. We are never going to get it right all the time. And so when we can do the COAST and we can use the COAST acronym, awesome. And when it just doesn't happen, remove judgment. It's okay. can continue to coach and support our kids imperfectly. That's the heart of being human.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's so important that you say that because, we're both professionals. We work in this space, but we don't get it right all the time. Sometimes it just doesn't work. When you've got your hand on the doorknob and there's a meltdown, it's really hard to remember those strategies in that moment.
Yes. And like I said, both same for like school and home, teachers that listen, parents that listen. It is all about just continuing to grow, right? Metacognitively, we can continue to learn. If we have that experience in the morning and we find ourselves, oh man, my patience was really low. Is there anything I can learn from that? Right? Like, is there anything I can learn and grow from that experience? Because I'm not always going to get it right, but I always can think about, can I learn and grow from that? I talk to my kids all the time, my brain is still growing and changing. I'm still learning how to handle my frustration. I'm still learning how to reroute. I've got a lot of strategies, but my toolbox will never be full. I'll always be able to get a few more tools in my toolbox.
Absolutely. And I think modeling that behavior and that process is so important as well. Like you talked about the example of, stepping away to take some deep breaths. Sometimes parents just do that. But if you verbalize it aloud, your child knows what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how it will help you to kind of regulate your own emotions. So you're modeling that behavior for them. And hopefully they will use that strategy in the future as well.
Yes. And I also say, think long game with this. Think long game. My daughter for a while, this is the example that comes to my mind. Her room, her ability, I'll start with the morning routine. Her morning routine, she would become distracted really easily. And we worked on a ton of strategies over a long time. And it just felt like no traction was gained, but it just kept going. And this past year, every morning she's using her tools. She's getting ready on time. But if I would have used some metric, she should get it within 3 months or within 6 months, I would have become frustrated and saying well, why isn't she getting it yet? Well, keep the course, modeling those skills across time and talking about it has an impact, even if you don't see it in a week or a month, whatever it is.
Right. And, it's important for parents to have tools. And one of the things you said that I think is important is that some families do need to work with a therapist, a psychologist to address that emotional dysregulation. But there are also some things that can be done in a classroom setting that can help all kids. And I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah. Do you mean active, regular, pro?
Yeah, absolutely. What can teachers do to kind of help all children in the classroom develop better self-regulation skills?
Yeah. And really in a classroom, I like to talk about that regulating with. How can we as a classroom support each other? That's why talking early with kids about all kinds of brains really matters to me. I was in a play museum with my kids yesterday and I saw the Fred Rogers quote about play and how, it's how we learn. And it just got me thinking about how not all play is celebrated when kids are young, talking about how autistic play might look, and so really centering while we're giving kids tools, centering around this premise that we all have different brains that benefit from different tools. And how cool is that, you guys? How cool is that? Because we need all brains for the future. So let's start creating some brain toolboxes. I like to actually make it really direct. People sometimes use cutie quotes about things. I'm like, your brain, let's talk about a brain toolbox. You got this thing inside your head that really is growing and changing. And let's give it some tools for when you feel big feelings. Or how about when you're working with a friend, you have different ideas. How will you handle that? I call it the brain toolbox or the problem solving toolbox, because that's what often happens when we bump into something a problem. That's when often we become dysregulated. How do I solve this problem? So teaching toolboxes for that. For really tuning into ourselves and our own management of emotional regulation, I typically like to talk about energy regulation with kids, because we know a lot of autistic kids and autistic adults talk about differences with interoception. So the more I can focus on, physiological energetic states, which is why I love Autism Level Up's framework. They focus on the energy meter. And so it's really tuning into what's happening maybe for you physiologically and centering there and grounding on that. And just becoming of what's happening with your body physiologically. I like to really focus. I like to have those tools around. And then, my brain toolbox. So when I have a problem, really this is going from a plan A to a plan B. How am I going to shift from a plan A to a plan B, right? And starting to practice that skill for kids. Because sometimes kids need that explicit language of thinking about how am I going to reroute from maybe what I wanted originally to do to something different. Whether it's we can't go outside for recess today. Whether it's my friend doesn't want to play with the blocks. Whether it's I can't have that car right now. How am I going to shift and reroute? And centering and honoring whatever your experience is around that, but teaching kids how to reroute and shift.
Right. I really think that is an essential component of an educational experience for kids. I think that it's just as important as reading and math. And it should be in classrooms at an early stage. You shouldn't be learning about your brain when you're in college. I mean, that should start in elementary school. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, whenever I talk to people at executive functions, they're like, oh yeah, right. You must work with high schoolers. And I'm like, yes, I do. And honestly, what I find when I work with kids in high school is if they haven't talked about their brain by that point, if they haven't learned anything about themselves, they've developed a lot of beliefs about themselves.
Yes.
I get like, I'm lazy, and I'm like, well, I have to counter a ton of false beliefs. Like, no, you're not lazy. You have ADHD, and so you have difficulty with time awareness and with knowing when to start a project. It's not because you're lazy, and if we can start early with kids and learn to celebrate your brain, learn to celebrate all brains and really all play, all forms of social communication, get in there early because these young kids, I bring in an AAC device, an augmentative and alternative communication device, and I talk about how speaking is just one way we can communicate. Those kids are like, cool, awesome. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And it's no big deal because we're normalizing it. And so the more we can normalize all types of thinkers, all types of communication, the more we can change the trajectory for what the school looks like for all of our kids as they get older and older.
Absolutely. And it normalizes differences. It normalizes differences in the way we think, the way we process information, the way we learn. And it decreases the stigma of kids who struggle in different areas. When we say, we all have different strengths and different weaknesses. Our brains are wired differently. Yes. And it's the differences in our brain that makes us unique.
Yes. And I think about it, I tell kids, when we do a task together, I'll say, if we only had one way to do this, we'd have no plan B. So the fact that we have different brains involved, there's just so many different ways to approach a problem. How cool is that, you guys? We need this. We need different ways to solve problems so that if the plan A doesn't work, whatever that plan A is, we've got a plan B. We've always got a plan B.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You also talk about prioritizing self-regulation in the classroom. Talk a little bit about that prioritization piece, why we should prioritize that, particularly in the classroom, because I have thoughts on it, but I want to hear your thoughts.
So I feel like there's so much pressure on teachers to prioritize reading and math and all these academic skills. And yet you ask teachers what it is that they're really noticing kids are struggling with. It's those self-regulation skills, that ability to manage ourselves. And so while I always say co-regulation is a top priority, we have to always be thinking about that. Teaching those self-regulation skills must be a priority. We have kids now who we're seeing just a shift with the increase in video gaming, with the increase of tablet use. Kids are having increased difficulty with kind of being able to generate and problem solve themselves, and differences in wiring in terms of orienting to when I'm having an interpersonal conflict, how can I handle that? So actively teaching these skills, actively teaching those skills of when I have those big feelings, what can I do? When I have a conflict, what can I do? When we have to reroute from a plan A to a plan B, what can I do? Those skills are for social and academics because they're going to pop up in both areas. So if I have a toolbox full of those skills, then I can make great gains in academics. Regardless of wherever I am, I can have a meaningful tract. But if I am not equipped with tools to really manage myself, and in fact, maybe I'm punished if I have different tools, academically, I'm not going to make many gains because number one, I'm probably going to get sent to the principal's office quite a bit. And number two, my availability for learning is going to be different. And so prioritizing those skills helps kids be more available, helps create greater connections within the classroom between peers, and really helps kids develop a healthy sense of self, which is like a top priority for kids.
Absolutely. It's key to so many aspects of your life, your relationships, how you navigate a classroom, your educational experience, and your well-being. And because you talked about how how you feel about yourself based on your ability to kind of regulate your emotions and problem solve in the moment and figure out friendships and how to respond. And what we don't want are kids who struggle in these areas feel bad about themselves, and then down the road develop, significant anxiety or depression as a result.
Yes. Yes. And that's why for me, it's dual fold. It's like, we want to give kids tools, and we want to also normalize, different, all types of communication and all types of play. And so it's like dual fold for me. That's why like the normalizing early on is really important, and giving tools. It's like that dance back and forth, so that as kids get older and older, it's normalized that people communicate differently. They play different. We all play differently. Awesome. We all communicate differently. Awesomely. You might use speech. They might use a communication device. They might use sign language. We all communicate differently. That's great. And getting tools for yourself to really be able to become, I think in The Body Keeps the Score, which I just finished. I just reread it. So good. He talks about self-leadership. And I think about that too, like that self-leadership capacity of how can I lead myself? And I think, I want you to have the autonomy to lead yourself, that self-leadership, wherever you want to go in your life.
So important. And this is such an important conversation to have. I mean, it's important at any time, but I think now where there are so many stressors on children, adolescents, families, and, kids who think and learn differently often have trouble kind of regulating these emotions. And this has been really helpful in terms of normalizing differences in the way our brains are wired. And then also you've provided a lot of great strategies and tips that parents and educators can utilize to help kids build up their toolbox, which I think is just so important.
Yes. And I think sometimes people, as an SLP, as speech language pathologist, people are like confused about why are you in there? And, because it's like, you're not working articulation. And I think what happened for me was it was prompted by my son's regulation, but then I was working, I do a lot of work with autistic kids, and I use the identity first language, which I'm sure your podcasters are familiar with, but I just wanted to throw that in there. And, kids with ADHD, and they regulate and communicate differently. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, this co-regulation matters for you. My kids at school, which I always realized it did, but didn't have the language for, like responding to them when they were dysregulated with compassion, and then giving them tools to learn themselves and their bodies and how to communicate joyously and autonomously. This is so incredibly important to me in terms of moving forward with our world and really empowering and celebrating all learners.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Danielle. And, I know that people are going to want to reach out to you and get more information. What is the best way for our listeners to kind of reach you and learn more about co-regulation, self-regulation, acceptance, and, just appreciating the differences in the way brains are wired?
Yeah. So, I'm on Instagram at Miss Danielle Kent, and also my website, daniellekent.com. I have a podcast and a YouTube channel link there. But I'm also I really do welcome questions by email. I'm really about giving people tools so that they can continue to advance and work on this area. So my email is just danielle@daniellekent.com. But I love to connect wherever you
Perfect. And I'll be sure to put all that information in the show notes. I cannot thank you enough for being here. This has been such a great conversation, and I just love the work that you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.